The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. The king of Syria is troubled and angry. 3 times now he has tried to ambush the Israelites, and 3 times they've avoided him, as if they know exactly what he plans to do before he does it. There's only one explanation, so he calls his advisors and servants and bellows, "Will you not show me who of us is for the king of Israel?" Everyone stands there, nervously glancing at each other, not sure what to say, like a group of boys having to explain a broken window to their angry father. Each is thinking, "I'm not the spy, but who is?" Finally, one breaks the dead silence, braving the wrath of his king, and says, "None, my lord, O king, but Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom." This sounds to us like the equivalent of somebody opened the door to the coffee house and a raccoon came running in and went straight for your muffin. But the Syrian king realizes that's a genuine possibility. This Elisha has just healed Naaman from leprosy, so he's obviously a man of God. What's the solution? Well, capture Elisha, of course. So the king sends out scouts. They find Elisha living in Dothan, a small city in the northern part of Israel, and they begin to march. The king knows Elisha may very well know he's coming. How can you fool a prophet like this? But he's got to try or give up his campaign against Israel completely. What good is making war if your enemy knows every plan you make? Yet he succeeds in surrounding the city with his army, and he's fairly certain Elisha is inside. Meanwhile, Elisha and his servant are sleeping soundly in their home within the city walls. The servant wakes up with the sunrise and dutifully sets out to draw water for his master. He's still a little groggy, so he stumbles out the city gates, rubbing his eyes, trying to clear them, and stops dead in his tracks. There before him is the Syrian army. He turns this way and that way and sees the whole city surrounded and runs in to tell Elisha. He bursts in to find Elisha sitting quietly and blurts out, "Syria's surrounded us. Alas, my master, what shall we do?" Calmly, Elisha's eyes meet his servant's panicked face, and he replies, "Do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." Now, Elisha can tell by his look that is now both panicked and confused that his servant doesn't understand. There's not nearly as many people in Dothan as there are in the army surrounding them, and this isn't a city of warriors. Patiently, Elisha takes his servant by the hand and leads him up some of the steps to the top of the wall and prays, "O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see." Instantly, as if they had appeared out of thin air, the young man sees angels on horses and chariots of fire, numbering more than he could count, all encamped around the Syrian army. Indeed, those that are with him and Elisha are truly more than those that are with them. He just needed eyes to see that the Lord is good. David needed the same thing early on in his life. And in Psalm 34, we see God opened his eyes, much like he opened the eyes of Elisha's servant. Psalm 34 is a psalm of new orientation, which, if you remember from our introductory lesson, are the psalms that are our chorus for those seasons of life where we have come through some difficulty and are on the other side. They are psalms that celebrate the times when God has acted in response to the prayers of his people. Life was disoriented and now is reoriented. But that doesn't mean it's the same chorus as when God's people were singing psalms of orientation. Something very difficult has happened. They've struggled and God has rescued them. They may be oriented again, but they've also been changed by the experience. Their eyes have been opened and they can see that the Lord is good, even more clearly than they could before the trouble. That's what Psalm 34 shows us. In particular, it's a psalm of thanksgiving, which are psalms that praise God for how he brought the psalmist through a crisis. Unlike the psalms of lament, they don't have a particular structure that they all follow that you need to be looking for. Instead, they invite us to think about what God has done for the psalmist, tell us what he's learned through the experience, and urge us to learn it too. But even though these psalms don't have a particular structure, that does not mean there is no structure in them at all. In Psalm 34, the thanksgiving divides easily into two major parts: testimony and teaching. In verses 1 to 10, David gives us his testimony, witnessing to God's faithfulness to him and the fear of the Lord that he learned through the crisis. Then in verses 11 to 22, David turns to teaching us the fear of the Lord, so we can learn it from his experience. David's eyes have been opened to see the goodness of the Lord, and through this psalm he prays, in a sense, like Elisha prayed, "O Lord, please open their eyes, that they may see that the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them." So, let's look at these two parts and learn. Of David, when he changed his behavior before Abimelech, so that he drove him out, and he went away. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul makes its boast in the Lord. Let the humble hear and be glad. O magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord, and he answered me, and delivered me from all my fears. Those who look to him are radiant, and their faces shall never be ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him, and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and delivers them. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. Oh, fear the Lord, you saints, for those who fear him have no lack. The young lions suffer want and hunger, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. As you can tell by the heading of this psalm, there's a backstory to it. Though really there are backstories to all the psalms, but only a few of them identify that story for us. The backstory of Psalm 34 took place early on in the life of David in 1 Samuel 21. David's been anointed king of Israel, defeated Goliath, become a general in Saul's army, gained great success, and made Saul very jealous. Saul wants to kill David now, and Saul's son and best friend of David, Jonathan, warns David, so he flees for his life. The story shows us that his circumstances were desperate because he was forced to flee from Saul to Gath, a city in the land of the Philistines and the city that Goliath was from. He probably expected Saul would never look for him there, which is probably true. But David also would not be welcome there. In fact, very quickly King Achish finds out that the great Israelite general David is in his city. By the way, he's identified as Abimelech by the psalm because that's just the general name for the kings of the Philistines, kind of like Pharaoh was the general name of the kings of Egypt. Anyway, he knows David is there, and David knows he's in danger. So David prays for God to deliver him, and then pretends to be crazy, which convinces the king that he's no threat and saves his life. Some people have looked at that story and said that David failed to trust God, which is why he acted like a madman. But I think Psalm 34 shows us that's not a valid or charitable interpretation. Obviously, he prayed for God to rescue him, and then he did what he thought was best, trusting God to make it successful. As Pastor Chris is fond of quoting from Oliver Cromwell, pray and keep your powder dry. I think that's what David's doing. He knows God is truly the one that made his act successful and delivered him, as this psalm shows. Then, seeing God act in that way and in response to his desperate prayer showed David that the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. David's eyes were opened like Elisha's servant, and he learned that those who are with him are more than those who are with any of his enemies. Indeed, if you follow the rest of his story after this through 1 Samuel, you find he trusts God even more because of this experience and what he learned. God proved himself faithful, and David's trust grew. This psalm of thanksgiving shows us that and teaches it to us. So let's look at what he learned. Verses 6 and 7 really sum up well what David learned from this experience. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. Poor really does describe David well. This certainly was the lowest point of his life so far. When he had to flee, he literally had nothing but the clothes on his back. He was a homeless man with a hunting party after him. But God rescued him. Now when I say that, keep in mind that it's not as if when David writes this psalm, his troubles are over. Saul's still after him and will pursue him all over the place for the next 10 chapters. Yet he knows that verse 7 is true and will always be true, as clearly as Elisha's servant did when he saw the angels. Now this is critical for us to remember as we read this psalm of thanksgiving. These psalms are our chorus for us when life has been reoriented, yes. They give a voice to our praise for God's work, yes, but it's not as if life is perfectly fine now. James Montgomery Boyce, a 20th century pastor and scholar, once said, "The promise of prayer does not mean that God will change every difficult thing in your life, but he will preserve you as long as he has work for you to do, and he will transform every difficult circumstance by his presence, and perhaps by the presence of others whom he sends to be with you." That last sentence is important. He will transform even the difficult circumstances by his presence. That's what verse 7 is telling us. And the fact that it mentions the angel of the Lord connects this psalm right away to Jesus. The identity of the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament is a debated topic in Old Testament scholarship. But I am in the camp that believes that when the Old Testament says the angel of the Lord, it's talking about the Son of God specifically. We don't have time to detail the arguments for why, but if Jesus is the doorway to the Psalms, as we talked about with Psalm 1, then verse 7 makes perfect sense if he's behind it. Verse 7 for us is really the equivalent of so many New Testament promises, like Matthew 28:20. He is always with us, guarding us with all power in heaven and on earth. He is the angel of the Lord who encamps around us no matter what we face. We're not facing human armies, and I doubt any of us is being hunted by a jealous king, yet we face the suffering of this world. We face our own sin, and we face the devil. And David is teaching us from his experience that we can know the angel of the Lord encamps around us. We can say with Elisha to our own souls, "Do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." With that kind of confidence that this psalm speaks as our chorus, verse 5 becomes clearer as well. Those who look to him are radiant, and their faces shall never be ashamed. There are two ways for something to be radiant. It can emit its own light, like the sun, or it reflects the light of some other object, like the moon. Which do you think is true of Christians? I think it's probably obvious. We are radiant because we are with Jesus. Even though life is still hard, like it was for David after the psalm, when we look to the Lord as David did and tells us to do, we reflect his light. And of course, since he's absolutely reliable, as David learned, then the second part of verse 5 does continue the thought. We can know that we will never be ashamed if we trust him. If our confidence was in us, then yes, we'd find plenty of reasons to be ashamed because we fail often. If our confidence is in him, he will never fail us, so we'll never have any reason to be ashamed. But you know, To get to this place where David is in this psalm of thanksgiving, it does take some suffering. Our confidence grows as it's tested, and God continues to prove himself faithful, as he did for David. That's why David compels his reader to taste and see that the Lord is good in verse 8. You know, you can't just read a cookbook and know the food is good. You have to taste it. And when suffering comes and we take refuge in God, we taste and see that the Lord is good. That puts a different spin on hard times, doesn't it? It's an opportunity for our faith to be strengthened like David's was, like Elisha's servant's was. So how, during this quarantine, have you been able to taste and see that the Lord is good? That's why David compels us to fear the Lord in verse 9. And it's really at the heart of what he's trying to teach us in verses 11 to 22. Let's read those verses. Come, O children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. What man is there who desires life and loves many good days that he may see good? Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Turn away from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears towards their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who are evil, to cut off the memory of them from the earth. When the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. He keeps all his bones, not one of them is broken. Affliction will slay the wicked, and those who hate the righteous will be condemned. The Lord redeems the life of his servants. None of those who take refuge in him will be condemned. If you remember our lesson on Habakkuk 3, we talked about how the fear of the Lord is an awe, reverence, and love for God and his mighty power. But that's not the way that David describes it, is it? He describes it not emotionally, but by action, following God's ways. That makes sense for two reasons. First, and most simply, if the fear of the Lord is truly reverence and love for him, it will make us want to obey and follow his desires. How can you love someone and live in awe of them and yet not want to live in a way that pleases them? Certainly, we don't always live holy lives to God, but we want to. The goodness of God that David experienced, that we taste and see as we take refuge in God, and that we enjoy, leads us by the hand to the good that we do. Second, David wants us to taste and see that the Lord is good. And how do we do that? Well, if you're reading a recipe in a cookbook, how do you taste and see that the food is good? You follow the recipe. If you start making alterations to the recipe and don't like the results, you can't complain to the chef that his food stinks. You didn't follow the recipe. In life, we're often tempted to think that God's ways won't work and we need to alter them. David was tempted with that many times after this, tempted and given opportunities to kill Saul and take the kingdom that was rightfully his. Yet he trusted God and waited for God's timing. That did mean he suffered more in the short term. But in each instance and in the long term, because he followed the recipe, he did taste and see that the Lord is good. And now he's testifying to that truth in this psalm. He's saying, it might seem more convenient to do your own thing, but trust me, I tasted and saw that the Lord and his ways are good. That's why David draws a contrast between the righteous and the wicked in verses 15 to the end. The way of the wicked may seem successful and easier in the short term, but David learned that wickedness always eventually leads to condemnation and judgment. Yet in all the suffering that the righteous experience in this world, God hears. He's near to them. He's for them. He delivers them. and they can never be condemned. Whether it's literal armies that we face or our own sin and the suffering of this life, he who is with us is greater than those who are with them. Notice, though, that David's view is balanced here. God brought him through a great trial, so that his trust in God has grown, and he knows the angel of the Lord encamps around him. But he also knows that he'll still experience suffering. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit, but that doesn't make them immune to pain. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, not none or even few. But the Lord still delivers them out of them all. It's deliverance, not exemption. And of course, if this weren't the case, then we'd never actually be able to taste and see that the Lord is good. Yet I'm a sinner, so is David, and so are you. How can we know that we are actually one of the righteous and not one of the wicked? Well, because Jesus, the angel of the Lord, lived for us as the righteous man and took the condemnation of wicked men and women like us. That's ultimately how the Lord redeems the life of his servants, which David looked forward to in faith just as we look backward. So as David opens our eyes like Elisha's servant to see that he who is with us is greater than those who are with them, we again see that Jesus is behind this psalm. He is the one who delivered us from all our fears. He makes us radiant. He is the angel of the Lord who encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. And he is the one who redeems the life of his servants, so that none of those who take refuge in him will be condemned. So, really, if we want to taste and see that the Lord is good, there's no better place to start than the cross. In fact, while Psalm 34 can be our chorus of thanksgiving at any point in life where we can see God act for us, what action of God would fit it better than Jesus redeeming us from our sins? You think about that. And next week, we'll look at Psalm 111. Amen.